In the frozen winter of 1943, a single message changed everything. Barely 10 words long, transmitted in a coded burst from the heart of Nazi-controlled Berlin, it would become one of the most mysterious intelligence transmissions of World War II. Marcel Clement wasn't supposed to survive his mission. French resistance intelligence had selected him knowing the odds. Less than 10% of deep-cover agents returned from inside German headquarters. But Marcel wasn't an ordinary agent. He was something more, a precision instrument of strategic information gathering. His background was unremarkable. A mathematics professor from Lyon, Marcel spoke perfect German and had an analytical mind that processed information like a human computer. When French intelligence identified a potential weakness in German military communications, they needed someone who could think 3 steps ahead of their targets. The plan was audacious. Marcel would pose as a civilian administrative worker in the Reich Communications Ministry, using forged documents that had been meticulously crafted by resistance specialists. His credentials were flawless, a transferred bureaucrat from occupied France with impeccable references and a seemingly mundane paper trail. What the Germans didn't know was that Marcel had memorized complex encryption protocols and had been trained to recognize and map communication networks. Every document he touched, every conversation he overheard, became potential intelligence. His photographic memory meant he could reconstruct entire communication systems without taking a single note. By January 1944, Marcel had embedded himself deep within the ministry's communication infrastructure. He wasn't just observing Bing, he was systematically understanding how German military intelligence shared strategic information. Each day he collected microscopic details that, when assembled, would reveal massive strategic vulnerabilities. The risks were astronomical. One misplaced word, one suspicious glance, could expose everything. Marcel lived with constant tension, knowing that discovery meant certain torture and execution. His movements were calculated. His interactions minimal. He became a ghost within the system, moving silently and observing everything. His breakthrough came in late February. Through a series of carefully orchestrated interactions, Marcel discovered a critical flaw in German communication encryption. This wasn't just another piece of intelligence. This was a potential game-changer that could provide the Allies with unprecedented insight into German military planning. But something changed. In the days following his discovery, Marcel's behavior became more erratic. His reports to resistance handlers became sporadic, almost cryptic. Something was happening behind the scenes that no one yet understood. Then came the message, 10 words, transmitted on a frequency typically used for routine administrative communications. Short, precise, loaded with meaning that would puzzle intelligence analysts for decades. The transmission suggested both a warning and a revelation, but its true meaning would remain hidden, locked in the complex world of wartime secrets and strategic maneuvering. What happened next would become one of the most debated intelligence mysteries of the 20th century. Marcel Clement disappeared. Not gradually, but completely, as if he had been erased from existence. Intelligence reports in the weeks following Marcel's disappearance were fragmented and contradictory. Some British and French resistance networks claimed he had been captured, while Soviet intelligence suggested he might have defected. The Americans had their own theories, each more intricate than the last. MI6 analyst Helena Rothschild spent months reconstructing Marcel's last known movements. Her meticulously assembled dossier revealed a series of anomalies that defied standard operational protocols. Marcel's communication patterns in the weeks before his disappearance showed subtle changes, slight variations in coded language that suggested something far more complex than a simple breach or capture. Recovered fragments from intercepted German communications hinted at something extraordinary. A series of cryptic references suggested that Marcel was not just an intelligence operative, but potentially something more. Decoded messages referenced a phantom asset with capabilities that went beyond traditional espionage. In the archives of the Reich Communications Ministry, discovered years after the war, there was a single unexplained file. Heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out, it contained a photograph of Marcel Clement, but not as anyone had ever seen him before. The image showed him wearing clothing that seemed slightly out of time, with a precision that suggested something beyond the 1944 photographic technology. Survivor testimonies added layers of complexity. An elderly German communications officer, interviewed in 1972, spoke of a strange incident in February 1944. He described a moment when the entire communications infrastructure seemed to momentarily glitch, a microsecond of absolute silence that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of the time. Marcel's family in Lyon knew nothing derivative. His sister Marie, who lived until 2001, maintained that Marcel was not just a spy but something more. Her cryptic statements intrigued researchers but provided no concrete answers. She would occasionally hint at family stories passed down minds whispers of unusual abilities that predated the war. Soviet intelligence files, partially declassified in the late 1990s, suggested Marcel might have been part of a highly classified program exploring human cognitive capabilities. Fragments of documents referenced experiments in neural mapping, information processing, and something called quantum communication protocols. The frequency of the old transmission continued to puzzle cryptanalysts. Modern computer analysis revealed mathematical patterns that suggested a communication method far more advanced than any known encryption system of the 1940s. Some theorists suggested Marcel had discovered a method of communication that transcended traditional electromagnetic transmission. MI6 archivists noted a curious detail. In the years following the war, multiple intelligence agencies, British, American, Soviet, and even German remnant organizations seemed intensely interested in Marcel's file. Requests, cross-references, and subtle inquiries suggested something more than routine historical investigation. A series of unexplained incidents further complicated the narrative. Between 1945 and 1960, several key personnel connected to Marcel's operational network died under mysterious circumstances. Heart attacks, accidents, unexplained disappearances. A pattern too consistent to be coincidental. French resistance records contained a tantalizing note. A handwritten margin comment in a 1946 WWII document read, "Marcel was not just collecting information, he was changing it." The statement, unsigned and cryptic, suggested something far more profound than traditional espionage. The mystery of Marcel Clement became more than a historical footnote. It transformed into a complex puzzle that bridged wartime intelligence, unexplained technological anomalies, and something that hinted at capabilities beyond conventional understanding. What remained consistent was the sense that Marcel was not simply a spy who vanished, but a pivotal figure in a narrative far larger and more complex than anyone could definitively explain. In the decades following Marcel's disappearance, a network of researchers and intelligence historians began to piece together fragmentary evidence that suggested an extraordinary trajectory. Elena Korsakova, a Russian quantum physics researcher, discovered a series of mathematical algorithms embedded in Marcel's recovered communication logs that defied conventional cryptographic understanding. Her analysis revealed a complex quantum encoding system that seemed to suggest information transmission through non-local quantum entanglement, a concept that would not be scientifically validated until decades later. Contemporaneous records from the French National Archives hinted at Marcel's connection to a secretive pre-war research group based in Paris. Fragments of correspondence suggested this group was exploring the boundaries between consciousness, information theory, and what some researchers cautiously termed quantum consciousness manipulation. A previously classified report from the Office of Scientific Research and Development in the United States contained a curious annotation. A marginal note referenced Marcel as part of a non-standard intelligence asset program, with keywords like cognitive resonance and information field transmission scrawled in the margins. British intelligence files from 1947 contained a heavily redacted document that mentioned Marcel in conjunction with a project codenamed Horizon Membrane. The few visible words suggested research into communication methods that transcended traditional electromagnetic spectrum limitations. Interviews with aging resistance members conducted in the 1980s revealed subtle, often contradictory accounts. Some described Marcel as possessing an almost intuitive ability to anticipate enemy movements. Others spoke of him seeming to know things that should have been impossible given his apparent resources and positioning. A private collection of wartime correspondence discovered in a Swiss bank vault in 1998 included a series of letters that hinted at Marcel's broader connections. References to scientific conferences in Paris during the late 1930s suggested he was part of an intellectual network that included mathematicians, physicists, and researchers working at the bleeding edge of scientific understanding. Forensic linguistic analysis of Marcel's surviving documents revealed something peculiar. The communication patterns suggested a mind that processed information differently, with a structural complexity that modern computational linguistics struggled to fully decode. It was as if his cognitive processing operated on a fundamentally different wavelength than conventional human communication. Soviet archival materials, when cross-referenced with French and British intelligence reports, painted an increasingly complex picture. Marcel appeared in multiple seemingly unrelated contexts, sometimes as an intelligence operative, sometimes as a research subject, and occasionally in roles that defied traditional categorization. A series of unexplained technological anomalies clustered around locations associated with Marcel's known operational zones during the war. Electromagnetic interference patterns, unusual signal propagations, and inexplicable equipment malfunctions were documented but never conclusively explained. Modern quantum physicists who examined the available evidence suggested that Marcel might have been experimenting with or inadvertently accessing information transmission methods that contemporary science was only beginning to comprehend. The notion of consciousness as an active information field, rather than a purely neurological phenomenon, began to emerge as a potential framework for understanding his capabilities. Genetic research conducted on surviving members of Marcel's extended family revealed subtle neurological variations that modern geneticists found intriguing. Specialized brain imaging techniques suggested potential cognitive architectures that deviated slightly from standard human neural configurations. The narrative around Marcel Clement was no longer just a historical mystery. It had transformed into a complex intersection of wartime espionage, cutting-edge scientific research, and phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about human cognitive potential. Each new layer of investigation seemed to generate more questions than answers, suggesting that Marcel's story was far from a simple tale of a missing spy, but instead represented a profound and potentially revolutionary understanding of human information processing and consciousness. The pieces of Marcel's puzzle emerged decades later during a forensic reconstruction project at the University of Cambridge. Advanced neuromorphic computing models, designed to simulate complex cognitive patterns, began producing startlingly resonant simulations when programmed with Marcel's documented communication signatures. These simulations suggested that Marcel's cognitive processing wasn't merely unconventional mind-t, it represented a fundamentally different mode of perceiving and interpreting informational landscapes. Dr. Elena Rousseau, the lead researcher, noted that Marcel seemed to operate with a form of perception that transcended linear temporal constraints. His intelligence reports and personal correspondence contained subtle markers, suggesting he could integrate information from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously, a capability that modern neuroscience could only theoretically conceptualize. Satellite imagery archives from Marcel's operational regions revealed additional anomalies. Geospatial analysis showed micro-topographical shifts in terrain that corresponded precisely with Marcel's documented movements, suggesting an almost symbiotic relationship between his cognitive processes and environmental dynamics. The most profound revelation came from a collection of Marcel's personal notebooks, discovered in a sealed archive in Marseille. These documents contained intricate diagrams that modern complexity theorists recognized as precursor models to quantum entanglement principles, sketches that predated official scientific understanding by nearly 2 decades. Marcel wasn't just an exceptional intelligence operative, he represented a transitional cognitive prototype, human consciousness operating at the intersection of intuitive perception, advanced information processing, and emergent scientific understanding. His life story ceased to be merely a historical curiosity. It became a profound meditation on human potential, on the boundaries of perception, and on the complex, often invisible networks of intelligence that shape historical trajectories. The OWL assessment wasn't about heroism or espionage, It was about understanding consciousness as a dynamic, adaptive system capable of transcending its apparent limitations. Marcel Clement disappeared not because he was captured or killed, but because he had fundamentally transformed. He had become something beyond conventional human categorization, a living bridge between known scientific paradigms and emerging understandings of consciousness, information, and human potential. His legacy was not in medals or military citations, but in the questions he left behind, questions that continued to challenge researchers, philosophers, and scientists decades after his disappearance. In Marcel Clement was less a person than a profound, unresolved hypothesis about the nature of human perception and intelligence.